A brand new book. It's called God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. It's a little light reading. Gerald Posner, welcome to Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Before we get to this book, I've got to tell people you've written a number of books, and one of your books I read, I think I was just out of college. It was called Case Closed. It was the definitive book on the Kennedy assassination. And is it true that you wrote that book and the goal was to prove the conspiracies, and through all your research, you realized that there really was no conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, I went in thinking the mob had killed Kennedy because of Ruby's murder of Oswald, and what I did is I let the facts lead me to a conclusion. The conclusion was just the opposite of what I went into it on. And I think, as a reporter, that's key. Same thing here on the Vatican. I wanted to follow the money in the Vatican, but I didn't know what the book would say at the end. It's hard to find a publisher often who's willing to give that faith to you, to say, go out and look at this subject, come back with whatever the conclusion is, and we'll publish it, because often publishers want to know what the conclusion is when they sign the book up. So I've been very, very lucky to have that, not just on Kennedy, on the Martin Luther King assassination, and now here on the Vatican.
The book is called God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. Gerald Posner, our guest. This story, I guess, developed while you were researching other books.
Yeah, I'd been researching a book on a Nazi fugitive, Joseph Mengele, a doctor from Auschwitz, back in the 80s in Argentina, and I came across archives in Buenos Aires that indicated that some of the Nazis who arrived in Argentina after the war were wanted criminals, had arrived with the assistance of bishops and priests from Rome. And I thought, wow, Vatican and Nazis, how can that be? And I sort of kept that in the back of my mind as an issue to look into. When eventually I found a publisher willing to do this years later in 2005, it turned out to be too narrow a focus. The real story wasn't about Nazis in the Vatican, it was about money. Follow the money, and that's what I did.
So how did you go about, well, first of all, you are Catholic yourself.
Right. I went to 8 years of Sisters of Charity and 4 years of the Jesuits. I was raised Catholic, and so, I went the easy path first. I asked the Vatican for help. They said no to the secret archives. They ignored many requests for interviews, and so then I had to do it the old-fashioned way, which was go out to archives, government archives in different countries, from Russia to Romania to England to the U.S., look at litigation files, interview people, and piece together a puzzle of what really happened in this history.
And so do we know, was it how they accumulated their wealth, how they stayed wealthy? What's the point?
How they accumulated and how they stayed wealthy. They got $1 billion from Mussolini in 1929, the equivalent of $1 billion. He gave it to them as part of a deal where they recognized him and he recognized them as a sovereign country. And they chose a financial wizard to take over that money and invest it. And he was just wonderful, this guy who ran it for 25 years. They formed the bank in the middle of World War II because they were doing business with both sides. They did it with the Americans and the Brits, and they kept doing it secretly with the Germans and the Italian fascists. I expose this in the book. They were following the green. They wanted to make sure that no matter who won, they came out ahead. And after the war, they spent the money in helping to fight communism. Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, sent millions secretly to Poland to topple the communist government and became an ally of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So that's how the money's been used, accumulated, and spent over the years.
So before the $1 billion that was given by Mussolini, was it a different story with the Catholic Church?
Before 1870, they were Pope kings. They had their own empire. So although they were head of the Catholic Church, they also had an actual empire called the Papal State, so they levied taxes, and that the taxes paid for. And then when they lost the empire to Italian nationalists and Italy was united, they depended on donations from the faithful, and they sold indulgences, which gave a piece of paper to the faithful that said you're forgiven for your sin if you pay a certain amount of money. But that wasn't enough to fuel the Vatican. That's why eventually they had to embrace capitalism, which originally they didn't want to get into. But once they embraced capitalism from World War II and on, they did it with steroids. And then they get involved in all types of business scandals, the mob, money laundering. It's one of those stories you think, this can't be the church, but then it is.
What about the value of their art?
It's terrible to say prices because you can't figure it out. We're talking billions of dollars, clearly. I mean, what would be the price if you took down the roof of the Sistine Chapel and sold it off to Russian oligarchs? So maybe they don't have the money anymore since oil is down. But,
right.
Sold it off to Chinese uber wealthy. So they're sitting on billions and billions of dollars in terms of art and holdings. They always are crying poverty. They're always saying we don't have enough money, so that's why they need contributions sent in. But the Vatican Bank is probably about the size of a mid-level investment bank in the U.S. You're talking billions of dollars. I mean, much of it's in the dark and still in secret, but we're learning more about it under Francis than under any other pope.
Yeah, now talk about the Vatican Bank, because I thought years ago, if you were Catholic, that meant you were not allowed to charge interest.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why I ended up. This was supposed to be a story that started in World War II. And how do I end up? with a 200-year history, because it ends up, I had to go back to the point where the Vatican used to be against any idea of even giving a loan with interest. That was capitalism, or usury as they called it, was the province of Protestants and Jews. Catholics didn't do it, and there was a ban on it. They came grudgingly, popes were against it, they grudgingly came to accept that idea. And that's why it's so unusual to see that just 150 years ago, the very church that was against giving a loan with interest, all of a sudden in the middle of the 20th century was involved with Italian businessmen who ended up murdered under a London Bridge, and one with cyanide in a prison, in offshore deals and everything else, because the Vatican Bank changed the whole equation. It operated in secrecy. It gave them an ability to do things they never could do before. The change in finances in terms of 100 years was as radical as anything that's happened in the 2,000-year history of the church.
The book is called God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. Gerald Posner. The Illuminati, the Freemasons, you mentioned the mob. Are they part of this story?
Yeah, the Freemasons, very interesting, because Freemasonry has always been, you could be excommunicated in the Catholic Church for being a Freemason. Mussolini banned Freemasonry, so they were in sync with that. And it turns out that after the war, there was a secret group of Freemasons in Italy called P2 Propaganda Due. When the Italian police eventually raided the house of the chief guy, there were nearly 1,000 members of that secret lodge, including former cabinet ministers, members of Italian intelligence, top journalists. It was so powerful, the Italian press dubbed it a government within a government. That group was doing business with the Vatican Bank. Businessmen who were members of that group were doing business with the Vatican Bank. There were stories that the American Archbishop who ran the Vatican Bank was a Freemason. He adamantly denied that. So Masonry comes in here, not in a Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code way, but it comes in as an interesting footnote to the entire story in the modern era.
How much grief did you get writing this, and how much grief are you getting now that the book is out?
Well, I haven't gotten the grief yet. I've sent a letter, actually, and a book to Pope Francis with a cover letter that pretty much says, this is the history of the finances of the church. Your Holiness, with all due respect, it's now your history, because you're the vicar of Christ on earth. You're the Pope. You're doing the right thing in trying to reform the bank, and I hope that you look at this history to remind yourself of how important these reforms are, that they be lasting. I haven't heard from anybody there yet, but because it ends on a note of hope, that I think that Francis might be the real deal and change this sordid history. I haven't heard much bad yet, but maybe it's coming.
You said you first reached out to the Vatican. They said no. While you were researching this, I'm sure they got word back to them that you were writing some things that were not too pleasant about the Catholic Church. Did they ever reach out after that at all?
No, they haven't, and maybe it would have been different if I had been doing the heart of this book at a time when Francis was Pope. It might have been a different thing. But the Vatican has a very interesting idea, and they do this on issues not only on my book, but on so many issues that come up when a scandal takes place. It's called the view of the long game, which is they have survived the ransacking of Rome. They've survived the French taking the Pope off in the Middle Ages to a prisoner in Paris. They've survived the Huns. They survived the Nazis. They've been around for 2,000 years. Stalin's dead, and they're still going strong. The bad news can come up, and if they just keep their head low, it will go away. And that was the initial response to the pedophilia scandals. That's why they weren't active in the beginning. They figured, okay, well, it'll just go away. It's not a great attitude, and I think that Francis will be more proactive.
Interesting. The book is God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. Gerald Posner, thank you very much for your time. Good luck with the book.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
You got it. 8:30 here, Big 550, KTRS.
Fascinating.
Holy mackerel.
The Big 550